Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was born on the 30th of August 1952. He had an unremarkable early life, and not much has been reported about this. But by the age of 21, he had decided to serve in the army. He was soon posted in the US Army based in Stuttgart, Germany. It was said that he got into trouble while out in Germany, but the authorities didn't do much to try and tame the beast that was Franklin. That was until one incident, which is said to be the start of a terrifying rampage. A young girl was walking home one evening and was kidnapped by two men, who she knew to be in the US Armed Forces. The two men put her in the car, which was driven by a third accomplice, and they drove the girl to a secluded area. Franklin was the driver. They assaulted her physically and sexually. This was a vicious attack, and many girls would not have been able to keep calm in this situation. This girl was different. She managed to remain composed and thought of a plan that would help police capture these men. She put up the pretense that she actually liked one of the men. Her choice was Franklin. She made eye contact with him and asked questions. Then later, before she was let go from her ordeal, she asked him privately for his phone number, and he obliged and gave it to her. This was a mistake for him. The girl managed to get to the police and tell them about the events of that evening. They were up for catching these criminals and asked the girl to call Franklin and arrange to meet him. But instead of her being there, it was going to be them, and they would be able to swoop in for the arrest and get this man off the streets for good, and hope that he would be able to give up the other two men who were also being hunted. The plan was executed to perfection, and Franklin was charged with kidnap and sexual assault, but shockingly was only sentenced to 40 months in prison for this brutal attack. Much more of a shock was that he only served a paltry 1 year in prison, and was released in 1975, when he was also discharged from the army. He was aged just 23. Franklin was now back in the US, and with a criminal record and no job or home, he settled down in LA. But during the 1980s, it was a terrible time for the state of Los Angeles. Many murders had been committed and were currently unsolved. The LAPD had a massive task in hand to identify the murderer or murderers. They believed they were looking for one serial killer who was ultimately responsible for the spate of murders. The task force that had been set up had been named the Southside Slayer Task Force, and they were responsible for finding this man who had now killed 15 women. All of these victims were drug users or sex workers. After a few years, and now in the mid-80s, it was known that there was more than one serial killer who was responsible for these murders, and the Slayer Task Force was dissipated, and the murders were looked into on a separate and individual basis. After some time, the LAPD had found that the serial killer Louis Crane was responsible for 2 or more of the apparent Slayer murders. Then a list of other perpetrators came to fruition. Michael Hughes, Daniel Lee Seibert, Chester Turner, and Ivan Hill, and even a detective by the name of Ricky Ross, all had at least one of these women in their victim count. And so the 15 women who were said to be killed by one man were in fact killed by many active serial killers at the time. Los Angeles was a dangerous place during the 70s and 80s. Many years had passed by, and it was now in the 2000s. Many murders of women had yet to be solved, and those who were convicted of murder were all inside prison. So why were there still similar murders happening in the Los Angeles district? A new task force had been set up since the previous one, who were responsible for finding the slayer, was shut down. This task force had been silently operating for some time before the discovery by the media. They had now started to report on this. So the authorities took it back into their power and started to release information of a 2007 killing. This was of 25-year-old Janika Peters. She was killed in Los Angeles, and DNA testing was performed on her, and remarkably, it was found to be a match to another 11 unsolved crimes, all with similar MOs to Janika's death. Over the next year, more information was released, and the families of the 12 murdered women were all informed that their daughters, mothers, sisters and aunties were in fact victims of a newly named serial killer that had now been dubbed the Grim Sleeper. The name was given to this particular person due to the fact the murders had a 14-year gap in between. Although this has since been disputed by many psychologists, stating that the murderer of this calibre would not have a 14-year gap between killings in fear of being caught. They usually commit murders over a shorter period of time, or if they were not caught, they would just continue to murder until they are. The press released some footage of a man carrying one of the victims' bodies and a van which was used in this murder, and a hefty $500,000 reward was put out for the capture of this heinous man. With a reward that substantial, it led to many false leads for the police to deal with. After a DNA profile was run through the system in LA, a familial hit was made to the Grim Sleeper murders. This means it was not a direct hit, so this was not the perpetrator, but the DNA of this one person was similar or a family link to the actual person who committed these crimes. The hit was on Christopher Franklin, who was in fact Lonnie Franklin's son. He had been arrested for the possession of a weapon, and an automatic swab was taken. Police were now closer than ever to finding their man. Franklin was now being watched. The police wanted to stop any further murders from happening. He had been out one evening for a meal in a pizza restaurant, and police who posed as a waiter took Franklin's plate and cutlery from his table after eating, and these were sent off for DNA profiling. It was a hit, and finally on the 7th of July 2010, Franklin was arrested. He was charged with 10 murders of women in Los Angeles. Most of these women were drug addicts or prostitutes, like many of the serial killers who were active during the 70s and 80s. He was trying to find women that people and society wouldn't miss, but he was wrong. These women had strong families behind them who all wanted answers and justice. Franklin's life was being unpicked. He was a mechanic who often tinkered with cars outside his home, and was said to be a quiet and polite man, a million miles away to who he actually was. Then in 1981, Franklin got a job as a refuse collector for the state, and even worked in sanitation at the LAPD for a short time. It was looked into how this man had been able to be on the streets killing for so long, and it was picked up that he was missed for a DNA profiling only 7 years prior, in 2003, when he was arrested and convicted of a crime which he served a 3-year probation period. The police were kicking themselves for letting this man still be on the streets when they had him in their grasp. Franklin's home was then searched on the 16th of December 2010, and what the police were to discover was to make US history. A collection of 180 photographs of different women were found. All women were said to be victims of Franklin in one way or another. Not all of these photos have been identified, and this is still ongoing. Once a thorough search had been completed, it was said that over 1,000 photos were found in total, and these photos were of some of the named victims of the Grim Sleeper, who was active in Los Angeles for over 2 decades. over 20 years of terror on the streets of LA. The photo obsession was apparently started in Franklin's first crime in Germany. He and the other two men took photos of the girl that he eventually served a year in prison for and was discharged from the army. Franklin's trial began in February 2016. This trial lasted a lengthy 3 months. Victims' families spoke in detail about their loss and grief to a man who remained completely emotionless. No remorse was shown from Franklin. Information was given about how, in 1985, 28-year-old Deborah was shot and dumped in an alleyway. She was Franklin's first known murder victim. Then, Henrietta, Barbara and Mary were all killed in 1986 and 87 and were shot with a .25 caliber handgun, the same as Deborah, and their bodies were just disposed of. One was even left in a bin wrapped in bags. In 1988, Latrika and Alicia were killed and were left dumped just to be found. All these murders while Franklin was married to a woman by the name of Sylvia, and they also had 2 children together. Shockingly, in 1988, a woman reported a crime to police, telling them that she was harassed by a man to get into his car. Once she did, he shot her in the chest and sexually assaulted her. She told police how he took photos of her, then when he was finished, he just threw her out of the car like a piece of rubbish and left her to die, which he thought she would. But somehow she survived this vicious attack. She was able to give a full and detailed description, and the bullet was extracted from her and matched ballistically to the other murders over 3 years prior to her attack. But still, Franklin remained unidentified. After over 13 years of apparent silence from Franklin, in 2002, the body of Princess Bertha Mew was found. She had not been shot like previous victims. She had been strangled. The same was to be said for Valerie, and the final victim that Franklin was being charged for was of Janika Peters. On May the 5th, 2016, the wait was over, and Franklin was found guilty of 10 first-degree murders and 1 attempted murder. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and told the court that the death penalty should be sought for such a manner of crime. The jury's plea was heard, and August the 10th was the day that the death sentence was given. Franklin was taken to the notorious San Quentin prison, where he awaited his execution date. In 2019, a blow to this case was revealed. Governor Gavin Newsom had planned to stop any executions of people who were on death row. This included Franklin, and nearly 700 people were given a reprieve. Newsom stated that no executions would take place all the time that he was in office. But this was not to help Franklin entirely, as on the 28th of March 2020, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was found unresponsive in his prison cell. An attempt to revive him was in vain, and he died. Franklin had been sentenced to death for 10 murders, but the grim sleeper has in fact been linked to over 25 deaths, and the count is still rising. Thank you so much for your continued support. Feel free to leave a comment, as we enjoy reading them. If you like the video, please hit the like button and subscribe if you want to hear more stories from Crime Busters.